phrase is a group of words that are together. Now, a phrase alone can never be a sentence. That's what makes it a phrase. It's a group of words, but it alone cannot ever be a sentence. A phrase is a part of speech, just like we have noun, pronoun, verb, adjective, adverb, preposition. We also have noun phrases, verb phrases, adverb phrases, adjective phrases, and prepositional phrases. It will help to remember what a noun, verb, adverb, adjective, and preposition is. Knowing that will help us understand clearly what each phrase means. Now, in addition to a phrase never being able to be a sentence by itself, a phrase will also never have the subject and the verb together. It can have the subject or it can have the verb, but again, a phrase will never have both subject and verb. If it does, it's not a phrase. Now, the 5 phrases that we have already discussed, we are going to be going into a little bit more details. Next, we are going to talk about a clause. Just like a phrase, a clause is also a group of words together. The difference is a clause can be a sentence by itself. Notice how I did not say that a clause will always be a sentence. A clause may be a sentence by itself, a clause may not be a sentence by itself. But regardless, a clause will definitively have a subject and a verb. There are 2 types of clauses: independent clause and dependent clause. And knowing how to differentiate between independent clause and dependent clause is extremely important because the SHSCT grammar section tests the students on this knowledge quite a bit. Again, to rephrase or to recap, a phrase cannot be a sentence by itself, while a clause may or may not be a sentence by itself. Phrases cannot have both subject and verb together. A clause will definitely have a subject and a verb together. Rule. So what is an independent clause? An independent clause is a set or group of words that can stand by itself as a complete sentence. An independent clause will have a subject, verb, and it will complete an idea or thought. Example, Julia volunteers at the animal shelter. In this case, Julia is the subject, volunteers is the verb, and where does she volunteer? At the local animal shelter. Now, this sentence has a subject, it has a verb, and it completes an idea or thought. Also, it has proper punctuation and capitalization. Therefore, since this statement can stand by itself as a sentence, this is an example of an independent clause. What's a dependent clause? Dependent clause is a set or group of words that cannot stand by itself as a sentence. A dependent clause can have a subject and a verb, but it does not complete a thought, and this is extremely important to understand. If you look at the example, Julia volunteers. Here I have a subject, Julia. I also have a verb, volunteers. But it doesn't complete a thought. Does Julia volunteer on the weekends? Where does she volunteer? How does she volunteer? When does she volunteer? There is a lot of questions we can ask because this sentence does not complete a thought. Now, it's important to realize that a sentence can be made up of an independent and a dependent clause, or it can be made up of 2 independent clauses. But it will never be made up of only 1 or more dependent clause. Never. Let's look at the example below. As the travelers came towards the end of the journey, they were relieved to be finally home. Now, in this sentence, we can see that the comma breaks the sentence into two parts. Now, which of these, if I were to take out of the sentence, which of these parts would be able to stand alone as a sentence? Whichever can stand alone as a sentence will be known as the independent clause because it doesn't require anything else, and the sentence that cannot stand by itself will be known as the dependent clause. Now, if you pay attention to the first part of this sentence, as the travelers came towards the end of the journey, if I were to put a period here, would this sentence meet all the criterias of a correct sentence? Now remember, what are the criterias for a sentence to be considered correct? It must have a subject, it must have a verb, it must complete a thought, and finally, it must have proper punctuation. What does proper punctuation mean? It means it must have a period at the end, or a question mark or exclamation point, and the first word has to be capitalized. Now, if we look at the sentence, as the travelers came towards the end of the journey, there is a subject, travelers. There's also a verb, came towards. Remember, this is actually a verb phrase now. It's no longer just a verb. They came towards. And then it does have punctuation because we put it there, but does it complete a thought? What happened as the travelers came to the end of their journey? Because we put this word as in there, it means as they were coming to the end of the journey, something in addition had to happen. Therefore, you can see that if I were to take this part of the sentence and take it out and put a period, I would not have a complete stand-alone sentence, which makes this a dependent clause because it needs more information for it to be considered a sentence. Now let's look at the second portion of the sentence. If I capitalize this T and put a period, which it already has, and I say, they were relieved to be finally home. Let's put it through the checklist. Does it have a subject? Yes, it does. Does it have a verb? Yes, it does. It actually has a verb phrase, were relieved. And then, does it have proper punctuation? Well, we capitalized the T and there was a period at the end, and it does complete a thought. They were relieved to be finally home. Hence, this part of the sentence is known as the independent clause because this clause or this part of the sentence can be taken out and it can be a sentence by itself, which makes it an independent clause. We will be doing more examples to clear up dependent versus independent clause. As we mentioned earlier, there are 5 types of phrases: noun phrase, verb phrase, adjective phrase, adverb phrase, and prepositional phrase. A noun phrase, as the name suggests, is a phrase that describes or has the noun. In our first example, an example of a noun phrase, well, the sentence is a jar of pickles is not dinner. In this sentence, jar of pickles would be the noun phrase. Verb phrase. A verb is an action word. Therefore, a very small puppy was shivering. In this case, was shivering would be my verb phrase. Notice the action word verb would be shivering and the linking verb was, but together they make up the verb phrase. An adjective describes a noun. The very small puppy was shivering. The noun here is the puppy. And what's describing the puppy? Very small. As a result, that's my adjective phrase. Adverb phrase. An adverb is a word that modifies a verb. The very small puppy was shivering non-stop. How was the puppy shivering? The puppy was shivering non-stop. Hence, that is my adverb phrase. Now remember, preposition is a word that gives us a spatial or location-related information. So common words such as above, below, on, in, under are examples of prepositions. Now a prepositional phrase therefore has to give me information about the location of the subject. In this case, the sentence is the very small puppy was hiding under the kitchen table. The phrase that gives me information about the puppy's location is under the kitchen table. Hence, that is my prepositional phrase. Now let's talk about a couple of examples of independent and dependent clauses. Let's look at the first sentence, our first example, and see if we can separate the independent from the dependent clause. The first example is that Sherry likes to go biking when she's bored. Now, the subject of this sentence is obviously Sherry, and the verb is likes. But remember, it's not just one thing. She likes to do what? She likes to go, and to go is also part of the verb. Therefore, likes to go is now the verb phrase. Actually, the verb phrase would be likes to go hiking. Sherry likes to go hiking when she is bored. Now, if I break this sentence up right here, and I put a period, Sherry likes to go hiking. Now, if I look at this sentence, does it have a subject? Yes, it does. Sherry. Does it have a verb? Absolutely. Likes to go hiking. And does it complete a thought? Yes, it does. We know what Sherry likes to do. She likes to go hiking. Therefore, this is an independent clause. On the other hand, if you look at the second part of the sentence, when she is bored, if I were to treat this as a standalone sentence, yes, it has a subject, she. Yes, it has a verb, is bored. That's the verb phrase. But the question is, does it complete a thought? What does she do when she is bored? The addition of the word when makes this a dependent clause because it does not complete a thought. Let's look at the second example. The second example, the airport was busy during Christmas time because of extra travelers. Now in this sentence, if I were to break up this sentence so that I put a period at the end of time, I have a sentence, the airport was busy during Christmas time. There is a subject, airport. Was busy is my verb phrase. And then, does it complete a thought? Yes, it does. The airport was busy during Christmas time. And we'll say it has proper punctuations, which makes it an independent clause. Now, if you look at the second part, because of extra travelers, even if we capitalize it and we put the period at the end, notice that this sentence cannot be considered a sentence by itself. It's a dependent clause. Why is that? There are travelers, which is the subject, but we don't know what is happening because of these travelers. It's not completing a thought. As a result of that, this is a dependent clause. And again, to recap, remember that a sentence can be formed from combining or by combining an independent and a dependent clause, or two independent clauses. You can never have a sentence that contains two dependent clauses. It's extremely important to remember that.